All right, we're going to start then. I am Dr. Ken Wilson, past president of Oregon Right to Life and a few other things. Past president Dr. Richard Thorne's here as well. Good to have you here. All his many years of work here in Oregon. The reason I wrote this book many years ago was because I had a conflict in a church in which I was a parishioner, and the leadership did not have any interest at all in advocating for life in a practical way. They would simply give mouth service to the fact that they were pro-life, but they had no interest in saying anything about how a Christian should act practically in life. A complete disconnect, as Father Pavone was saying. And so that's the reason this book was written, was my own exploration. How does a Christian actually deal with this issue, political and religious, and how does it relate? So that is why the book was written. So what I'm going to do today is give you a quick overview. I can't do the whole book in 50 minutes, but we'll give you a quick overview to give you a taste of what's happening. And these books are out on the display area, and for a $5 donation to Oregon Right to Life, you can have a book, okay? If you want it signed, you can get that free too, but that's a $5 donation. All right, so that's the moral mandate to vote, and it really is looking at social justice. How do Christians deal with social justice? Is it an issue with which we should be involved? Does the Bible teach social justice? And in what way? Why should I be concerned as a Christian? Why should I be concerned about social justice? And then third, if the Bible does teach social justice, how do I obey Christ? So I sat down at Genesis and I went through Revelation and I said, let's just read the whole Bible and look for verses on social justice. Well, I found a couple of them. And what's amazing is if you look throughout the Old Testament, and this is just the Old Testament, list. The New Testament has all over the place too, but it's full about caring for the poor, caring for the needy, caring for life. I mean, it's everywhere. And we're going to talk about the parable of the Good Samaritan in the New Testament, which I think is the best one to explain it in the New Testament. So what is like the greatest commandment, right? Who is my neighbor? Who was a neighbor in this story? And then finally, how do I love my neighbor? So you guys know the story pretty well. I'm not going to read every aspect, but basically you have a man that's traveling and he gets beat up by some thugs and they leave him half dead on the road. And it literally says half dead in the original Greek and the Latin for that matter. And so he's left half dead on the road and a couple of religious guys walk by. I don't think that's a coincidence. Jesus had them to be religious guys. Religious people, big shots, and they go right by him. And this outcast, this nobody comes and helps the man, right? So we're not going to, I guess I read the whole thing, but I want to do this part and just say, what is the greatest commandment? You guys know, what is the greatest commandment? That's right. Love your neighbor as yourself, right? So that's pretty easy. So the question is, who is my neighbor? From the parable, who is my neighbor? Everyone. Yeah, everybody, especially those in danger, especially physical life, right? Any human in physical danger is my neighbor if we take the parable at face value, right? So, who was a neighbor? The Samaritan who did what? Yeah, exactly. What did he do? He saved his physical life. He was half dead, and he saved his physical life. That's how he was a neighbor. That's how he loved his neighbor. It's really not that difficult, right? Pretty easy. So how do I love my neighbor? I save his or her physical life. You said, which of the one was neighbor? He says, the one who showed mercy, right? He showed mercy to that man by saving his physical life. It's very simple if you look at the parable of the Good Samaritan, all right? So, pure worship, true religion. James tells us it's to what? Take care of the fatherless and the widows. That's true religion. And in James 2, if you see a brother or sister who's naked, has physical needs, and you don't care for them, your faith's worthless if you're not caring for their physical needs. So in Galatians, Paul is meeting with some other people, and the leaders in Jerusalem, he says, they only asked me to do one thing. What was it? You can preach the gospel, just do one thing. Take care of the poor. Take care of the poor. That's what they wanted to do. So social justice is all over the place when we look at it. So what I want to point out is that spiritual isolationism is anti-biblical. That is that it's just me and God. I can go to church, I can have my personal relationship with God, I can do this, and everything's fine. That is a wrong mentality in Scripture because it demands that I love my neighbor if I'm really spiritual. True spirituality, according to James chapter 1, right? So we have to love our neighbor, and it demands physical care of my neighbor in need. That is the issue. Without it, even worship is repulsive to God. Remember in Amos where God tells them, hey, take away all your feasts and your worship stuff and your sacrifices? I don't want that. I want what? Love your neighbor. Take care of the physical needs of those around. So, loving our neighbor in the womb. So you guys, I'm going to blow through this pretty quickly because if you're here, you better know this. If you don't, you need some help. All right? Is the fetus a person? If yes, God expects us to love our neighbors in the womb. That's why I call them neighbors in the womb, and this requires the gospel of justice in action. So if you go over the fetology and the science, it's a scientific fact that life begins at conception. Nobody can argue that fact. Embryology, when the sperm enters the egg, it's human life. It has 46 chromosomes. It's genetically different from the mother. End of discussion. It's easy. It's a human life, and it's different, right? That's the fetology. We go to Christian women and abortion. Half of abortions are performed on Christian women. In Oregon, in America, 250,000 abortions are done on Christian women every year that we know. So as I talk in different places, especially in religious settings, I always offer the opportunity for a woman to come forward and tell me if she's had an abortion. Why? Because every time I speak, there's one woman who has never told a soul except God that she's had an abortion. And I get the opportunity to extend forgiveness to this woman on behalf of the Lord and just say, He does forgive you. You need to hear that verbally from someone. It's not that I forgive you. It's helped so much to hear somebody verbally express forgiveness on God's behalf for you, all right? And you can't repent if you don't know the truth, and that's part of it. You guys have seen these pictures. You know what the fetus looks like. When I would talk at secular universities, I would say, how old is this child? And they would always get it wrong. Nobody knew this was an 8-week-old. They couldn't even believe it. Couldn't figure it out. So God's image as a person. If you look, Esau and Jacob fighting in the womb. I mean, you wonder why the kids fight when they come out. They're already fighting when they're in the womb, right? Brothers and sisters. Okay, the fetus, shines its, you shine a light, it hides its eyes. The one from Vanderbilt, you guys know this picture, where it's a natural reflex as he grabs the finger. But, there's no question this is a human being. What I thought was very interesting as I went through Scripture is seeing that God just didn't say so-and-so was born. What does He say in Genesis? She conceived, and then it was born. He makes a big point out of conception where the sperm enters the egg and a new life begins. God emphasizes that repeatedly in the book of Genesis. She conceived and then bore. She didn't say just born. Why? Because conception is a big deal to God. That's why it's in there. John the Baptist was filled with the Holy Spirit. King David was formed by God in Psalm 139. Jeremiah was called as a prophet. And guess what? Jesus was a fetus. Jesus was a fetus. Now, I'm glad he wasn't aborted. We'd all be in big trouble, wouldn't we? Right? Jesus was a fetus. Criteria for a human person, I go over this. This is, you look at Thule, you look at Peter Singer, you look at these guys and what they put out to be a human person. It's absolutely unbelievable. If you use physical development, the myelization of the brain is not complete until a child's 1 year old. So why don't we wait until 1 year old to have it? I mean, a cat's smarter than a kid at 6 months and will always be if the brain never myelinates. Intellectual capacity or mental retardation. I mean, people aren't they human because of that? What if an older patient gets Alzheimer's or dementia? Are they no longer a person? And what about self-awareness? Coma patients? None of the actual arguments that they use hold any weight if you think about it logically. So as we look at the conclusions on fetology, there is definitely a unique human life that begins at conception. God holds that person. God views fetuses as persons, and person status is derived from God's image. It's not a bunch of other criteria that we might try to bring up arbitrarily. Because that person is conceived in the image of God, that is what makes a person status. And the The human being and person debate is something I talk about in the book. I just have to mention it. Anytime somebody starts talking about a person instead of a human, you're in trouble. Why? Because person is a legal term, a legal person. A human is a biblical term, and it's a logical, ethical term. But when somebody separates person, well, they're not a legal person. It's what they did to the Jews, what they did to the blacks, what they did to any minority they want to suppress. You call them not a legal person. They're a human, obviously. So when somebody starts throwing legal person around, you better look out, because somebody's getting ready to be killed. That's the way it works in reality. Denial of legal personhood, as I mentioned, the blacks in 1857, German political party with unborn, the handicapped young kids, and then the Jews. And then the Supreme Court did it the same thing with abortion and partial birth abortion. So, a history of abortion in America quickly. If you look through the medical literature on abortion, it's really interesting because the American Medical Association called this murderous destruction. It was prohibited in all U.S. territories, and it wasn't until 1962 that it started, and then it just went like an avalanche throughout the country. So this is a very recent development. Younger people don't quite catch this because they haven't heard the history of it. But that's the real question. Here's Chief Justice Blackmun in '73. We need not answer the question when human life begins. Why not? I mean, isn't that the question? Why don't we have to answer the question? Because he doesn't want to answer the question, because the question has its obvious answer. And if you answer it obviously, then you can't kill people like they want to do with abortion. So it represents only the potentiality of human life. And there it is. See that? See that word right there? Legal personhood. There you go. That's the problem right there. You separate a human from legal personhood. If you look at the comparison between the Supreme Court decision and the Dred Scott in 1857, and if you look at the abortion issue in 1973, it's pretty impressive, the parallels between the two. The same justices on that Supreme Court, not the exact same persons, but the same justices, made the same stupid decision twice. And it's very impressive how that works. A 7-2 decision, it was legal, therefore it makes it morally right. That slave was the property of the owner can sell or kill it. Human, non-person, because they're black. The location determines the person. They ignored the evidence and the precedent. They trample states' rights. They said, don't impose morality on us, and they ignore God's law. If you look at 73, the exact same thing happened. It's absolutely stunning. If you know history, you just get appalled at what actually happened in these Supreme Court decisions. So, yeah, I wish I could spend more time just talking about all those. You guys get the idea on what's happening there. It's pretty impressive. All right, God views abortion as murder. Exodus 21 is a very enlightening passage. This has been debated by theologians, but I don't think there's much of a debate if you understand the context. It says, if men strive and hurt a woman with child, so that her fruit depart from her, so she's pregnant and she has a delivery of the child from a hurt, and yet no mischief follows, he shall be surely punished according as the woman's husband will lay upon him, and he will pay as the judges determine. And if any mischief follows, then you will give life for life. So if this woman gets hurt, it's a couple guys fighting, she delivers prematurely, the child's fine, then the person who injured her still must pay, all right? But what happens if the child dies that comes out prematurely? Then that dead child, that person who injured her, must die. It's life for life. That's how important God thinks life is in that unborn baby. It's not just a bunch of clump of cells there. God views it as a human life, and you give life for life if that happens. Yatsah can be, the Hebrew yatsah can be translated premature birth. It's not miscarriage as the Living Bible, NASB, and some of the modern translations try to make it. It's not a miscarriage, it's a premature birth. Otherwise, there's no way that the child could come out without mischief. So as we look at the conclusions on abortion from that aspect, if you kill an unborn human, God views it as murder. If you read the early church fathers, I did patristics at Oxford, and if you read through these guys, they are very clearly opposed to abortion, just one after another, against the Roman practice of killing infants. Not just abortions, but actually killing babies. They did that. Abortion was murder in American law until 1970. And it's still murder in America if the child is wanted by the mother. Wow. I hope you're wanted. I'm glad, guys, you were wanted by your mother. That's a good thing. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here. I'm going to suggest that in the voting, that the thing we need to focus, as Father Pavone said, is at the right to life. Life is God's priority. That is his emphasis. If you look through Scripture, that is it. Genesis 6, the flood destroyed the earth. Why? Because of man's violence to one another. That's what it says. It was the violence and the murders of each other. In Genesis 9, God's first societal law for government was punishing murder, the very first one. In Numbers 35, murder pollutes the land with innocent blood, requiring God's penalty. And then we've seen Luke 10, we save the life of our neighbor. That's how we love. Now this is where it gets a little interesting in the book, and people will get uncomfortable when you start talking about this to them. First degree homicide is intentional and premeditated, first degree murder. Second degree is intentional, but it's not premeditated, where you get kind of blow up and get angry and you kill somebody. Third degree is criminally negligent. That's like if you're a drunken driver and you hit somebody you really didn't intend to, you had no premeditation, but somebody dies as a result of your actions. That's third degree homicide, all right? Third degree homicide. Now, death due to negligence is murder. Now, God also points this out in Exodus, and we'll look at that. But in American law, if you unintentionally negligently kill somebody in a DWI, it's still considered homicide. If you have an indirect killing, it's homicide. I don't know, you guys are, so some of you are old enough to know John Gotti, the mafia boss. He hired people to hit someone, and he was convicted, and he didn't actually kill the person, but he asked somebody to, and therefore he was put in prison as a result. So unintentional, that's negligent, and indirect killing are murder. So when we look at 21 in Exodus, we see that God views it the same way. In fact, most of our laws are taken out of Deuteronomy and the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses. So look at 21. If an ox gores a man or a woman, gores like the horns and, stabs him, gores a man or a woman that they die, then the ox shall surely be stoned and his flesh shall not be eaten. But the owner of the ox shall be clear, right? But, here's the key, if the ox were accustomed to push with its horn previously, if this ox, was a bad dude and he was always out pushing on people and trying to hurt people, and it had been testified to the owner. And the owner knows that this ox is a bad dude, knows that this bull is not going to behave, and he has not kept it in, but that he has killed a man or a woman, the ox will be stoned and his owner will also be put to death. That's pretty impressive. You see the parallel there? God's saying, okay, if you know that you are putting a life at risk and you don't take action and that happens, you are guilty of murder. I mean, is that difficult? I mean, is that kind of obvious from the passage there? You have to give that life as a result? I think it's pretty obvious. So God calls it murder when a person chooses another priority over saving a human life that is known to be at risk of death. If that guy said, well, keeping my ox to make money is more important than the life of the human person, he calls it murder, and that man must forfeit his life as a result. When we vote, it reveals our core values. If I vote for this or that, it's going to tell me where my priorities are when I'm voting. It's a conscious choice with tangible efforts. We're supposed to submit everything to Christ's lordship, seek His kingdom and His righteousness first, and God's priority is the protection of human life. So if that's God's priority, what should my priority be? Protect human life. That's the priority. So it's a Christian duty to vote. These are different people, Christian leaders who will say it's a Christian duty to vote. You can read the book. It has all the quotes in there. Pope John Paul II has a very important quote saying our involvement must be political. He's got a lot of other great things to say that I've got in the book, but that should give you a taste of it. But when you look at the actual voting records of Christians, there's a real disconnect between what we know we should do and what we actually do. 50% of Christians aren't even registered to vote. That only leaves half of Christians. 50% of registered Christians do not vote. That leaves 25% of Christians. And then, out of those that do vote, 40% voting Christians vote pro-choice to kill babies. Now, they're not voting because they want to kill babies, but they vote for other things instead of saving the lives of babies. So they're doing negligent homicide. The Ox-Gore thing, right? That means only 15% of Christians are voting pro-life. 15%. That is why we're in trouble. We need to register to vote, we need to actually vote, and we need to vote pro-life, right? That's pretty simple. But you wonder why we can't win in Oregon? Because only 15% of Christians are actually voting to save the lives of our neighbors in the womb. Only 15% are voting God's priority. So, we're going to change that. We're going to educate our neighbors on what's happening. So, in Oregon, it's exactly the same. And in fact, I'll just guess what the #1 group in Oregon is that votes pro-life. I mean, if you had a denomination or consigned a religious group, who would it be?
Evangelists.
Nobody's gotten it. You won't believe it. The Catholics and the evangelicals and all these groups are at the same level. They all are about 25 to 35%. It's just horrendous. Mormons are the ones that vote the most pro-life in Oregon. All right? Shame on us. All right, priority voting. You know, voting for the priority. And I'm going to give 2 talks on single-issue voting, same ones after lunch. But we're going to talk about priority voting, not single-issue voting, priority voting. And I think that's the difference, and that's the point I'm going to make. We'll do the demonstration there because I just don't have time to go on with it. So the causes of church failure and social responsibilities. If you look at what's happened in America, and that we've overreacted to the liberal social gospel. We've reduced the gospel to going to heaven. We've ignored Old Testament and New Testament passages on social justice. We've trivialized New Testament scripture obligations to society. We've forgotten God's first law after the flood, and we've missed Christ's example of laying down His life for others. I mean, there's a lot of problems there. Paul, and I will say this, Jesus and Paul and numerous other apostles plainly pointed out that bad company corrupts good morals. You wonder why so many priests and pastors and problems are falling into sin and having such serious problems. The influence of society is pushing. It's very, very difficult even for a genuine Christian who's committed to resist. So we have to be aware of that's our problem for not pushing social justice and the meaning there. Here's a very interesting aspect from Emperor Julian. This guy was not a believer. He was a heretic. Christianity has been especially advanced through the loving service rendered to strangers and through their care for the burial of the dead. He does not like Christians, and he's praising them. It is a scandal that there is not a single Jew who is a beggar, and that the godless, meaning those who don't worship the gods of Rome, Galileans care not only for their own poor, but for ours as well. Who would think, right? While those who belong to us look in vain for the help we should render them. Why? Because we as Christians, when we step forward and we do social justice, caring for the physical needs of other people, especially saving their physical lives, we're giving a powerful example. It doesn't make any difference if they're blacks, if they're Jews, if they're from Mars. I mean, whatever. If it's a human life, we need to protect it. And that's what is especially powerful to people around us. So impacting society is both biblical and possible. But here's what's happened in America, the same thing that happened in Germany. And I'll go over the German stuff. Thomas Jefferson, you've always heard the separation of church and state baloney. That is a pure fabrication. Thomas Jefferson held services in the White House, right? He gave a Bible, had a special Bible printed for the American Indians. It was missing a few things, granted, but it was a Bible given to the American Indians by government money. He paid for a courthouse and held church services in the courthouse where he paid the minister in Virginia So, I mean, there's a lot that he did that has nothing to do with the Danbury Baptist Association. Why did Jefferson say there's a separation of church and state? Not to keep the church out of state involvement, but so that the state itself would not impose a religion on the people. Where did Jefferson originate? Where did this whole thing come from? I mean, we came from what little island over here? England. They had a what? An imposed state religion, right? That's why people came to America, to get away from that. So Jefferson was not saying separation of church and state so the church never gets involved in the state. He's saying don't make the state impose a religion on the people. That's the difference. And we've turned it on its head now. Again, the younger people don't recognize that this is a fairly recent development in America. You'd have to read the book. I don't just have time to go through all of them. But everything has just fallen like dominoes when we got rid of prayer in the Bible in school and tried to make this artificial separation of the church and the state based upon these problems. But I want to show you what's happening in America versus what happened in Germany. And these guys that are doing this have a very clear pattern. This is Joseph Goebbels, who was Adolf Hitler's right-hand man in 1935. To educate the young people into religious ways may perhaps be the task of the church, but to educate the young in politics is very much our affair. The young belong to us, and we will yield them to no one. For the churches, there is only one solution, which will ensure peace. Back into the sacristy. Let the churches serve God. We serve the people. See what they did? They got the hearts of the young people and they molded them and said, you keep your religion in your churches. You stay out of our country and our involvement in society and in government. That's how Germany went down and why so many millions were killed, right? Here's another quote. This one, I think, is from Adolf Hitler himself, 1933. We have brought the priests out of the party political conflict and led them back into the church. And now it is their desire that they should never return to that area for which they were not intended, right? They made a purposeful, systematic opportunity to take all the Christians and put them back into the church where they could not be any use to society, right? So, the separation of church in Germany came from several things. First of all, pietism, that I can just worship God, I can just love Him, and I don't have any obligation to my neighbor, right? Just me and God, that's it. Secondly, the government removing church from the public arena. And third, doctors in society requested the sanction of killings. Euthanasia, abortion, those sort of things started in Germany, and that's how it came about, very, very simply. You guys know the statistics, 54 million unborn babies have been killed. It just keeps going. They're legally killed. In Oregon, this is very interesting. Father Pavone mentioned that we are going to win this. You know, we're actually making progress in Oregon of all places. If we can make progress in Oregon, we can make progress anywhere, right? I mean, oh my gosh. All right? Look at the statistics in Oregon on abortion. This is from the Department of Health Services here. It's not any of ours. 1968, 323, 69, 1407. Now you see what happens there is it just keeps climbing. In 1995 to 2002, you've got this. But watch what happens. See it coming back down? We're about here in 2013, last year. I mean, there's still over 8,000 children that died, that were murdered last year in Oregon. But we're starting to go back to the early 1970s in the number. Why? Because people are being educated. The young people are, you know, you show the little picture of the baby sitting there and they go, oh, that's a baby. You know, I mean, they're getting it, and we're starting to educate people and let them know, you know, there are really some harms in abortion. Women could get breast cancer from having abortions. They have trauma psychologically. There are real issues that go on. And so they're starting to get this, and that's exciting that we're making progress in Oregon because people like you are out working. So give yourselves a hand, you know, good job. Keep doing it. All right, reasons abortion is still legal. First of all, it's a multi-billion-dollar business in America. Huge big business. You got Planned Parenthood, NARAL, the fetal parts going on. I'm not even going to go there. You guys are familiar with what happens there. But more importantly, that we as Christians, priests and pastors, have not done our responsibility, and we have not taught that voting is a spiritual act, that voting reflects our values and should reflect God's priorities, because we've said, here's the voting, we'll do all this, here's my spiritual life over here, and the two won't meet. But that's an artificial separation that God does not respect. All right. Some reasons the churches will say that we shouldn't talk about abortion. That is, too many members or parishioners opposed abortion. Well, that's why we should talk about it. I mean, women have been damaged. They're guilty. I mean, I'm a doctor. I'm a hand surgeon, for goodness sake, and women will come in with depression and grief and stuff, and they don't even realize why they're depressed. And and you look at the history, they've had an abortion there. And I'm not saying everyone that comes in as an issue there, but many, many do, and it still affects them. It's a problem. It's not a spiritual issue, it's only a social issue. Again, that's the German lie. If we talk about abortion, it's divisive, and people go off in the church. It's not a problem in our church. Right. Somebody's clueless. Sheesh. I mean, if you just took a poll in your church, if you could do an honest poll in your church about how many women have had an abortion there, or how many men there have told their wives or their girlfriends to have an abortion, you would be shocked. It is prevalent. And we're unwilling to deal with the political personal fallout. Now, I've got to make a point right here. Father Pavone and Bill Toffler and Wesley Smith and I were talking out there, and we believe that we're in a place in America right now where if you take a stand for this, you better be ready to pay the price. That they are starting to pick off leaders that are against the laws that God has placed down as moral and ethical laws. And if you oppose those, if you say, we're going to stand up for what God wants, you're going to start paying the price, right? And I can tell you that from experience. There is going to be some fallback. So you better be committed if you're going to do this. Don't just think you're going to get skirt by. If you take a stand, there's going to be a price to pay. So, a Christian's responsibility on life issues, it starts with self, educating yourself, doing what you need to do there, and then you go up to loving our neighbor, taking care of the physical needs, then you get on to the church, educate your church on what's happening, and then go on to society and make that happen. So, does the Bible teach social justice? Yes. How often?
You have 15 minutes.
Thank you. Good. We'll have a good time for questions. How often does the Bible teach social justice?
Multiple.
Right. Should I be concerned? Yeah, you're here. That's good. You're concerned. If the Bible teaches it, how do I obey Christ? Speak up. Go ahead. Love your neighbor. How do you love your neighbor?
Help them if they're physically in danger.
Excellent. That's exactly right. Save the life of his or her life. Good job. I mean, that's the parable of the Good Samaritan. It's really not that difficult. All right. So, I've got some arguments in here that are kind of humorous, and I think I'll take a moment to go over them because, as far as political involvement in the churches shouldn't be. One of them is the church is not a financial institution, all right? A financial institution collects money and distributes it. Therefore, the church should not collect money or distribute it. Is that logical? It's logical, but it's wrong, right? Or the church is not a symphony orchestra. Symphony orchestras play music that evoke emotions. Therefore, the church should not play music that evokes emotion. Right? Logical, but completely wrong. Right? It's the same way with voting. The church is not politics. The church is not government. But does that mean that the church should not be involved in government and in social issues and in politics? No, it's not. The only reason the church now is in trouble is because Lyndon B. Johnson from Texas, when he was a senator, put a rider on a bill, a little back thing slid in there to keep people from endorsing or supporting a political candidate if you're a 501c3 organization. That's why it is illegal in America today. All right? All right, Thomas Jefferson, the care of human life and happiness and not their destruction is the first and only legitimate object of good government. Ours has failed, right? Love thy neighbor as thyself. So, single issue voting, this is what I'm going to do the next time, and it's going to be far more interactive. I'm not going to have a bunch of PowerPoints. We're going to ask questions, and you're going to have to give answers. And I'm going to yeah, I'm going to be the devil's advocate, and you're going to have to come up with some good answers. Single issue voting, is it simplistic or is it rational? Is it naive or is it defensible? What about principles versus priorities? And how pro-life must a candidate be? And is in voting pro-choice always a sin? Those are the sort of things we'll discuss, and you're going to have to give some answers on what you think and why you think so, all right? Okay, so we've got plenty of time for questions here. If you have anything you want to bring up or discuss on voting. Yes? Yeah, yeah. No, in fact, when I teach at the secular colleges, I'll say, you know, a theist is the only one that really has a legitimate reason to be an environmentalist. And all the students kind of look at me, I go, well, if you believe this all came from nothing, and then who cares what happens to it? It'll all recycle, and we'll get to do it again. You know, not a problem. But if I believe that God created the earth, and that I'm given stewardship over it, and I have an obligation to care for it. So I'm the only one with a legitimate right to be an environmentalist. You have no right at all. So.
Categories.
Sure.
Just
Yeah.
rationalizing. How do I?
Well, of course it is. I mean, again, that's the point about myelization of the brain. Because if you have a newborn child and you're holding that child, if you stop the myelization of the brain, it's kind of like if you got a hard copper wire and it has a plastic coating on it. That's kind of like myelization of the brain. If that doesn't develop at the 1 year of age time, by that time, that kid will be no smarter than a cat. I mean, it's just going severely mentally retarded. All right. So, are they a person yet?
They're a human.
Yeah, well, they're a legal person by definition so far. I mean, that's, if it were up to Singer, that wouldn't happen. You get a couple months to figure it out if you wanted the child or not.
Yeah, but then you go backwards in the womb. Then
Yeah. See, the point is, if you look at human developed, there's no point that isn't, by any definition, a human being. A human being, and it's living. I mean, do you have to have a heartbeat to be a human being? Well, I mean, what about a cardiac arrest where the person's heart stops for 2 minutes? Are they not a human being during that 2 minutes? I mean, and then it starts again. They resuscitate them, shock them back. I mean, the arguments people use are ludicrous. I mean, if you just think about them a minute, it's very obvious that those criteria cannot work. They're not valid. And the book goes into that, so you can look at that, Kathy, and do it. Yes?
I have a question.
Okay, there are two different issues here. One is, could they get in trouble? The two, is it legal? Okay, you're working on a moral, ethical issue. That is the job of the church, to work on a moral, ethical issue. What you're prevented from doing is speaking directly for or against a specific candidate. Okay? Okay, you can do moral issues all day long. Now, does that mean you won't get in trouble for it? No, if the ACLU finds out, yes, the church could get sued for that. I mean, they could go after you. There's nothing, I mean, whether it's legal or not, they'll attack anybody. So, yeah, two really different questions there, but there's nothing legally wrong with having a moral petition in a church.